Hello, welcome to Film Independent Presents Virtual Edition. My name is Matt Warren. I'm the Senior Manager of Digital Content here at Film Independent. And before we get started with today's very awesome Q&A for the new Showtime documentary, The Real Charlie Chaplin, I want to take a minute to shout out a couple of our program's loyalist supporters. So thank you to our lead sponsor, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, and to our online screening partner, Vision Media. And with that, I'm very excited today to be chatting with one of the co-directors behind this incredible new documentary, which I'm sure you all just got done watching and enjoying. I am here with Mr. James Spinney. How are you, James?
I'm good, thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Now, I think everyone watching this will have just seen the film, but we're here to talk about your film with your co-director, The Real Charlie Chaplin, and people could probably guess from the title that this is a documentary about the life and the work of Charlie Chaplin.
One can be insecure with a childhood like his.
I stalked New York, but he's here.
Chaplin once said, all the adulation is not for me, it's for the little man.
Thought anybody loved him? He never believed it.
He was always acting. He didn't want people to know the real Charlie.
Those people who are tremendously successful at a young age, it usually destroys them. You know, that's what it makes them.
But I had no idea who the man was.
I wanted to start by just kind of opening up a general conversation and asking you, in your opinion, what was it about Chaplin's sort of talents as an artist and a performer that sort of meshed so well with cinema in its early days? You know, what were the factors that made Charlie Chaplin such a phenomenon as this new medium was dawning?
Yes, that's such an interesting question. I mean, Chaplin's life, to some degree, seems so intertwined with film. Like he was born in 1889, and in the film we look at, you know, one of the films that came out in 1889, a Thomas Edison film, and it's this sort of hazy, impressionistic blur. But then as Chaplin grew up in the 1890s in South London, that's the point where we first start to see South London on film and represented. And then as Chaplin goes to Hollywood in the 1910s, you know, Max Sennett has created Keystone Studios, who kind of launched Chaplin. But when he first steps onto screen in 1914, films were just beginning to spread across the world. And then quickly, within a couple of years, by 1916, Chaplin is the most famous person in the world. And not just the most famous in a way that hadn't been possible before because of this new mass media technology, which was meaning that people from all backgrounds of all languages were kind of falling in love with Chaplin through his tramp character. And I think that's a really interesting quality in terms of what it was about Chaplin, because, you know, at the time, silent film, this new art form, was seen as something akin to visual Esperanto. That's a term that you hear at the time. So there's this sense that film can be watched by people from all backgrounds, can be sitting side by side in cinemas across the world, all watching the same film and laughing and kind of losing themselves. And so there's this kind of liberation of identity that comes with silent film. And Chaplin is kind of the emblem of that because you know, he plays this nameless tramp character who kind of comes from nowhere and seems to be going nowhere. He's constantly playing with identity, with gender, with sexuality. He's upending authority and class. So he's this very fluid character who also just communes with the audience. Like we talk in the film about Chaplin's eye contact, the fact that he looks straight at us from across the screen. He does that from his first film as the Tramp, or the first one that's released, Kid Auto Races. In the first moment he steps on the screen, he's looking at us and kind of building this rapport with us. And I think that intimacy that he strikes up with the audience, which you still feel over 100 years later, when you watch them, you feel this crackle as he looks at you. It's kind of flirtatious and mischievous when he does that. And watching his films today, we found that they felt fresh and subversive, even over a century later, and also felt like a type of cinema that we don't see today. And so it's very hard to, I think, to break down exactly what it is about Chaplin. And we spend a long time in the film looking at his costume, and the fact that though he claims to have assembled this costume in a kind of moment of panicked inspiration, there are lots of other people who claim that they got there first, and then there are lots of other people who imitate him and rip him off and kind of pirate him. And that's a bit of a wild goose chase. But what I think you get from it is the fact that though everyone else can wear the hat and the moustache and carry the cane, and even do the walk, they don't have what Chaplin has. They don't have this quality, which is so hard to define, but which is so obvious when you watch his films.
And you include in your film, you sort of recount this sort of mass delusion that I was familiar with by after reading the Glenn David Gould book, Sunnyside, which is also about Chaplin, in part, where all of these people, thought that Chaplin was coming to them, or that they had seen Chaplin. There was sort of a moment of mass delusion where Chaplin sort of manifested himself in all of these different areas. And I had assumed that was a literary invention on Glenn David Gould's part until I looked a little further into it and found out that that was something that actually had some precedent in reality. Could you maybe describe that odd phenomenon a little bit? Because I think that goes into what we're talking about just the mass reach of this character and this artist at this time.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Sunnyside as well, which is a beautiful book and which kind of takes this event from I think it's December 1914, where supposedly on a single day, Chaplin was being seen in places all across America simultaneously. So there were sightings of him in train stations, and there were crowds gathering, and then there were people in hotel lobbies who were paging him, and there was something happening on this day. And in Sunnyside, the wonderful book, it's kind of dramatized to the point where he's seen by a lighthouse keeper in a dinghy. I think in our film we play it a bit straighter, and we just use that day to kind of look at what seems to be happening at this moment. Silent film, as we've said, is a very new phenomenon at that time, and so there seems to be some kind of mass hysteria, as you say, going on, which people call Charlie mania, Chaplinitis. The Chaplin craze, it has all sorts of resonances, I think, with Beatlemania 50 years later. And it manifests in all sorts of ways. It manifests in these extraordinary contests you get where people are dressing up as Chaplin. And the big kind of rumor or joke maybe was that Chaplin entered a Chaplin contest and came 30th, I think. And as well as that, he's being pirated. His films are being re-edited and repackaged and stolen. There's people like Charles Chaplin, whose real name was Charles Amador, who was a Mexican actor who was releasing sort of imitation Chaplin films. And Amador's defense when Chaplin sues him for this is that he wasn't actually imitating Chaplin. He was imitating Billy West, who was a famous Chaplin impersonator. So, that sense of where things begin and end, that kind of swirling sense of just adulation for him that was really taking height at that point. I think I said 1914, maybe it was 1916 actually that this all took off, because that was the moment, I think, where his fame really took a new leap. And he really kind of, by that point, hundreds of millions of people across the world were regularly watching Chaplin films. So this wasn't just an American phenomenon. In France, he was called Charlot. He was Charlie in parts of Africa. He was Carlitos in Spain. Sidakwa in South Africa. The Japanese called him Professor Alcohol, Sensei Akura. So it was this international phenomenon. And for us, I think then the big question is, well, what psychologically does that do to you if you're at the center of all that, and And also, I think in terms of Chaplin's relationship with his character, which had made him so famous, which obviously drew so much on his own life, on his insecurities and his humiliations, but which had now catapulted him into this unprecedented fame. And interestingly, Chaplin supposedly said, and we quote this in the film, all the adulation's not for me, it's for the little man.
Well, that actually goes into my next question, which one of the very interesting elements of this film that I found watching it is that it's about the whole of Chaplin's sort of life and career. And Chaplin is synonymous with this one character that he created, which is iconic in the literal sense of the word in its visual presentation. But you do a very you guys as filmmakers do a really great job of sort of contextualizing that character within the entirety of his career, and showing how Chaplin's career was both bigger than just this one character, but also, as you were just saying, how this one character sort of subsumed everything, sort of ultimately. So was that sort of a very conscious choice to sort of contextualize the tramp character and make a distinction between that and Chaplin as a writer, director, filmmaker who had this sort of larger career and more stuff he did?
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that, because that for us was, I think, one of the big puzzles in terms of the interface between Chaplin and the Tramp. And I think also because we sensed very early on that this gulf between the sense of identification and intimacy that people felt with Chaplin through his presence on screen, through the things that we've talked about, this this rapport that he creates with the audience through breaking the fourth wall, for example, and just just how brilliant he is, and how kind of loving I think his films start to become with things like The Kid, in terms of the emotion that starts to creep in, which of course is mining his own traumas and humiliations. In The Kid, Chaplin's sort of revisiting the separation that he experienced from his mother at a young age. And so I think to some degree we were always really amazed at how when Chaplin kind of made it, when he had this huge studio and this army of people at his disposal, he kept sort of journeying backwards and journeying inwards, and revisiting those South London streets that he'd left, and rebuilding those streets in his Hollywood studio. The attic room that he lived in with his mother is so similar to the attic room in The Kid.
That was really striking. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
And you see it as well in the gates of Kennington Park, where Chaplin met for a date with his first love. They're so strikingly similar to the gates, the park gates of City Lights. So this sense of returning and circularity is just sort of key, I think, to the Tramp character. The Tramp. Chaplin says about the costume that the Tramp wants to be dignified, but his shoes won't let him. He's constantly humiliating himself and kind of trying to be sort of a somebody, but he can't. It's built into the costume. It's sort of central to the whole starting point of the character. And I think that's so interesting when you start to understand the traumas and humiliations that Chaplin experienced as a child. He talks a lot in his autobiography about wearing certain clothes and being embarrassed by those clothes as a child. So then for him to create this character in this costume where that's just so central to it, as well as the endless gags about hunger and food that you see in Chaplin films. You're never far away from a gag involving food, which of course resonates so strongly when you realize how hungry Chaplin was. And Effie Wisdom, his childhood friend, who we hear from in the film, talks a lot about hunger and the hunger that Chaplin experienced. So I think, in answer to your question, I think it was this sense that perhaps for us the moments that we felt most closest to Chaplin, and that we felt that he was being most vulnerable, was through his work. It was through his films. It was through The Tramp. And it's interesting that there's this kind of fairy tale quality to the fact that by playing this character that's replaying these pains of his childhood, he's catapulted into something that's so far removed from that experience, where he's now the highest paid entertainer in the world and the most famous person in the world. And suddenly he's in these highly respected circles and living in Beverly Hills in this huge mansion. And I think that sense of him always going back, but also being in this entirely new space where it seems to some degree that, and reinventing himself as well. You know, we hear from his childhood friend that he used to have this very thick Cockney accent, but when we hear from him in the 1960s, he's got this very elevated voice. So there's this constant reinvention that that's going on with him off screen, even when on screen he's constantly returning to poverty and hunger. And that felt very interesting to us. And it seems like Chaplin put a lot of defenses up in his life off screen, even though his films are so open and transparent and vulnerable. Like, you know, the people who knew him best said that he was always acting and always performing and always on show. And rather heartbreakingly, you know, at the end of the film, we hear from his children, many of whom you can feel their yearning to connect with him and this sense of distance that they felt. You know, his daughter Jane says, "I grew up with the icon, but I had no idea who the man was." So I think that strange paradox between him being universally known and loved but also so hard to reach was sort of the puzzle of the film.
And you know, you just mentioned sort of a bit of the distance between him and some of his children and that. And, you know, this is a very all-encompassing biography, and, you know, you would call it, you know, a warts and all. It doesn't shy away from the sort of more problem aspects of his personal life or some of the things he was involved with. And, you know, it's a very honest portrait. And I'm wondering, you know, sometimes when you're a biographer, whether in film or literature or anything else, and you're trying to do a sort of like warts and all portrait of someone, it can sometimes become all warts, no portrait. But I think this is very respectful and admiring, obviously, of the parts of his life and career that deserved admiration, while being honest about who he was. And I wonder if you could talk about sort of striking the right balance between, you know, incorporating some of that messier stuff and not letting it overwhelm the rest of what you're talking about when you're talking about Chaplin.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that balance was something that we were very conscious of throughout the making of the process. And obviously, in so many ways, it's a huge challenge in terms of just the scope of a film like this. You know, it covers Chaplin's 88-year life. And we're trying to tell what is one of the great rags to riches stories, but also encompasses this huge body of work, and which is very, I mean, heartbreaking and frustrating in terms of what not to include in terms of his work as well. Like, you know, there've been great documentaries that have just been made about his time at Mutual, or you know, a single one of his films. So it's a huge challenge, always a balance of these different elements of trying to examine him as a filmmaker, to examine his roots, to look at him as a director as well, and not a director, writer, producer, editor, composer. And then, of course, looking into his personal life and how he was as a father and as a husband. And in that respect, as you say, it's a challenge because, you know, Chaplin had 4 wives and an awful lot of relationships as well. You know, he once boasted to having had sexual relations with 2,000 women, I think. But having said that, there's so little testimony to kind of root these sorts of that kind of examination in, like, you know, of Chaplin's 4 wives. We only really have recordings with Lita Gray. His first wife, Mildred Harris, isn't on tape anywhere. Paulette Goddard did 80 hours of interviews with Andy Warhol, which seem like they might be fascinating, although she's quite cagey about him from what we've read. She doesn't give much away, but those seem to be locked in the Warhol archives, and we couldn't get hold of those. Chaplin's 4th wife, Una, who very much was the love of his life, and it seems like of all the people who knew him, she understood him best, and his daughter Geraldine makes that very clear. But she destroyed most of her writing about him. But we do have a few interviews with Lita Gray, who is his 2nd wife, and his divorce from Lita Gray was the most scandalous divorce in Hollywood history at that point, and as well as the most expensive. And some of the things that she describes about their relationship are really troubling. You know, of course, she was very, very young when when their relationship began. She was originally in his film The Kid when she was 12 years old. They married, she became pregnant with his child around 15 or 16. The birth dates are unclear because of certain birth certificate issues which might have been falsified, which is all very complex and best not to go into. But what really resonated, I think, with today for us was this sense that Lita felt like she found it very hard for her to get her side of the story across. You know, she talks about how at the time she didn't feel like people could reconcile what she was describing with the character that people knew and loved on screen, and that she was disbelieved because people idolized Charlie. And some of the revelations that she talks about, the fact that during their honeymoon, Chaplin suggested that she should jump off a train, you know, that he threatened her. And she was very young at the time as well. And so, you know, all of this is really troubling. You know, when during the story, of course, we come to identify with Chaplin and root for him, especially because of the troubling upbringing that he sort of escaped. And so, yeah, holding all these things in balance was a real challenge, and one that we're very self-conscious of as well as I think as male filmmakers. And you know, Lita talks about how her story had often been controlled by men, whether it was the lawyers who were kind of in charge of her divorce case, or the people who co-wrote her memoirs and kind of ghostwrote those with her. So we hope it's part of a wider conversation and part of a kind of a constant, I think, reassessing that is going on, not just in terms of Chaplin, I think, but also more societally. You know, it's clear that the media and the establishment were to some degree able to ignore this behavior for a long time. And it's only really when Chaplin began making political statements, I think, that that kind of protection began to change. And so I think it's also interesting to think more structurally about what's at play in those sorts of moments.
I wanted to ask, before we move towards wrapping up here, I want to ask about one very interesting creative decision I found in the film, which is the fact that the sort of narration that takes us through the events of Chaplin's life is done sort of in the present tense, sort of in active present tense rather than the past tense. And that just seems like such a small detail, but I feel like it adds so much in terms of the tone and the atmosphere and sort of the understanding and really the immersiveness of this story. So I wonder if you could just talk about that creative decision a little bit.
Thank you. I'm so glad you picked up on that, because that felt like a real breakthrough when we were sort of scripting the narration with Pete and I and our good friend and brilliant writer Ollie Kinderberg, who wrote the script. And it felt like, I think we were thinking a lot about Chaplin and presentness, because I think there's a kind of meditative aspect to watching a Chaplin film. You know, you feel like, you know, we've talked about this eye contact and this sort of sense that he creates. Also, all the film play out in kind of mostly in wide shots. He uses close-ups very sparingly. And I think because of that, because there aren't many cuts and the languid pace, I think you experience a different kind of way of viewing when you watch Chaplin films, which I found really refreshing in terms of, and in some degrees it was hard to match that with the edit pace that we had to have with the rest of the archive, with the more sedate clips of in terms of how they're shot. So this sense of presentness and being present is very interesting, of course, especially with Chaplin kind of, as we've said, kind of reaching out to us from across time. And I think when we watch Chaplin films, we felt this sense of time dissolving and of that we weren't watching films from over 100 years ago. That, you know, that I think when you watch a lot of other silent films, and I don't mean to be down on silent films, because it's been such an adventure to kind of dive into the subject more for the last 3 or 4 years, and so often I'm surprised by just how fresh things feel. But I think Chaplin is unusual in quite how fresh and modern they feel, and how much you just feel like, you know, he's even just some of the gestures, the way that he'll just do something that you think, what, people did that then? Like, you know, in the pawn shop when he's kind of he's been handed a clock and to try and assess whether it's fixable, he takes it apart and unscrews it like it's a can of tuna, takes out all the insides, he's bashing it with a hammer, then he's a doctor kind of, and then at the end he's just like, no, sorry, there's nothing we can do. And the kind of sheepish way that he says there's nothing we can do. When I saw that, and you see that the people in the 1910s are just doing that same expression that you do now, that sense of time.
Shrug emoji.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we always felt this presentness when we were watching Chaplin, and we wanted to convey that in the voiceover, and the voiceover, which is read by the wonderful narrator Pearl Mackie, who is very good at inhabiting this sort of Chaplin-esque quality of being she kind of code switches, and she's sort of she's able to kind of, I think, be playful, I hope, and mischievous, and I think when we heard her, what we felt when we heard her audition for it was that she kind of feels like, hopefully she's sort of a companion, I think, for the audience, and she's got her sort of arm around you and is watching the film with you, and hopefully just sort of observing things with you. And yes, as soon as we switched from the past tense to the present tense, it's sort of changed from, I think, feeling like a more conventional narration, which we were trying to get away from. We didn't want to do a sort of voice of God type thing. We didn't want to have like a middle-aged man doing it. We wanted to be someone who could be as fluid as the tramp, I think, in that sense. And Pearl really kind of brought that through. And central to that was this breakthrough of putting it on the present tense. And so I'm so happy that you kind of picked up on that. Thank you.
No, I love when there's like just a little twist on something that kind of makes you hear it a different way, or like lean in a little bit closer and pay a little bit more attention. And you kind of touched a little bit on well, a lot bit on how sort of modern Chaplin's work feels in comparison to some of his contemporaries. And just to wrap up here, I kind of wanted your diagnosis of where you feel Charlie Chaplin and his films are at sort of 100 years later, currently in today's sort of cinematic landscape or understanding, or just where is our understanding and appreciation for this artist now? And do you think it'll continue to endure? Do you think it'll grow, contract? I mean, I'd be curious to think where we're at in terms of what we think about Charlie Chaplin 100 years later.
Yes, well, thank you. That's such an interesting question. And even though we've just spent years making this film, it's also one that I sort of feel not quite qualified to answer, in the sense of like that we've learned so much about Chaplin, but kind of the sort of relativism of like weighing up of where he sits in terms of the context of today is such a huge question that I find it almost very hard to get a grasp on, especially because there's so many ways to read it as well. I think, like, you know, in terms of Chaplin's process, it's so interesting because he was working in a way that was kind of very unusual at the time, in terms of him working without a script and kind of just diving headlong into films with just the tiniest of idea, just a fragment of an idea, and kind of improvising endlessly for years in terms of the features. You know, he spends years on City Lights, but still doesn't understand the basic sort of premise of how this mistaken identity between him and Virginia Sherrill, the flower girl, will work. So that's so interesting because, you know, bigger productions now, I think it would be kind of unheard of to let someone just go off and shoot. I mean, maybe you could say, I guess, like Sacha Baron Cohen or something could do. So I think, you know, certain types of comedy, perhaps, I think maybe where it's perhaps responding more and perhaps has like a slight, you know, foot in documentary is interesting. In terms of Chaplin's fame, it's interesting because, you know, to some degree, obviously, you know, the internet and media today is so international and we're so interconnected. But in another sense, I think the kind of the silent quality of the films that we were talking about earlier, in terms of their ability for people to identify them without them being changed at all, really, you know, because the intertitles in Chaplin's films are to some degree often, you know, he had this bet with Buster Keaton supposedly about who could use you know, fewer intertitles in their films, and so they're not essential to understanding them, and there's so much that you get. And so I think to that degree, the kind of international quality of Chaplin's fame and the adulation that he experienced is quite hard to work out whether or not there is a direct equivalent to today. And then, of course, yeah, how Chaplin's life, it's interesting how Chaplin was the first person to experience that type of celebrity, which hadn't been possible, as we've said, before him. So they, you know, he didn't have anyone else to kind of to compare what that must have been like psychologically. Whereas I think now we're still clearly struggling with our identification with media and how we relate to online personas and kind of avatars and our presence on our kind of virtual presence. So it's interesting that Chaplin, you know, is very much kind of, you can draw a direct line between Kid Auto Races and him looking at us and those types of conversations we're having today. And, you know, there's so much nowadays about parasocial relationships and that sort of thing. And so it's interesting in terms of, yeah, the lineage of celebrity to think about Chaplin and today. But then in terms of the work, you know, Pete and I, you know, knew Chaplin's work before we started the film, but we hadn't taken the deep dive that we were lucky enough to have. And the more we've discovered, you know, the kind of the richer the work has become, and not just through Chaplin, you know, through all of the silent films that we've been lucky enough to kind of watch. And so I feel but you know, when I look back to watching them for the first time when I was a teenager, I had this kind of misapprehension of silent film, as I think a lot of people did. I sort of imagined Chaplin as this kind of, you know, hyper slapstick figure who would kind of be played at the wrong speed. And but what I found is, as you've said, is this kind of modern subversive thing, which still feels so fresh today. And so, you know, I hope that this film it plays a tiny part in being an introduction, hopefully, to people who've not seen his films and for people who do know his work, that there's a lot to discover too. You know, we feel so lucky to have had the chance to make it and to take that dive. And I hope that, especially because of this quality that we've talked about when you watch silent films, which is different to watching films today, I hope that, you know, that like me, people will be taking that journey backwards as well.
James, this has been a ton of fun. Tell our viewers where they can find The Real Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah, so The Real Charlie Chaplin is playing from December the 11th on Showtime. And thank you, Matt. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.